Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Hedgehog After Hours. My name is Kyle Edward Williams, and I'm an editor at the Hedgehog Review, which is a journal of ideas and cultural analysis. The Hedgehog Review is published by the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia, which is an interdisciplinary research center and community that seeks to understand cultural change in the modern world. And I'm very glad to be joined by my friend Paul Nedelisky tonight. Paul is a philosopher by training, and he is assistant director at the Institute, and he's going to introduce our guest and take us from here. Go ahead, Paul.
Thanks, Kyle. Welcome, everyone. Tonight we have John Owen, who is the Ambassador Henry J. and Mrs. Marion R. Taylor Professor of Politics at the University of Virginia and a Senior Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture. We'll be talking about this book, The Ecology of Nations, American Democracy in a Fragile World Order, John's latest book, which came out last year. He's published several other books before that, including Confronting Political Islam, 6 Lessons from the West's Past, The Clash of Ideas in World Politics, and Liberal Peace and Liberal War, among others. The way this will go is I'll open things up with a question for John. He'll talk about his project a bit. And then as you have questions, there's a function on your interface, your Zoom interface, where you can write a question down, and Kyle and I will see those, and we'll try to get to all the questions. If there's a lot, we may not be able to, but we'll do our best, and we'll keep the conversation going. So with that, John, how did you get interested in this project? Did the idea come right away, or were you kind of in a range of ideas and hunting around and it slowly coalesced? What's the story?
It was the latter, Paul, and let me open by thanking the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture for really being, without which the book would not exist. And I could go on about that, but I'll keep it at that. And thanks for having me on this evening. I've always been interested. So I study international relations. I don't study first and foremost American politics or democracy. I'm, of course, interested in those things, but my specialty really is foreign policy and international relations. And there's a long old school of thought in my field that says it doesn't matter if a country's a democracy or not. All countries act the same toward each other because they have to. They're in a situation that forces them to set aside principles. It washes out the differences in their institutions, and they're just countries like billiard balls bouncing off each other. And I get that, but I've always been skeptical that that's the case. So many years ago, I wrote my doctoral dissertation on something called the democratic peace, which is the claim that democracies don't fight wars against one another. They do fight wars, obviously, but they just don't fight each other, and that's a statistically robust finding. It's held up over a lot of studies, but we don't really know why. So I wrote about why that is, and that put me in this camp of people who said democracies are different in some ways. And then I got really interested in how democracies sometimes, but not always, promote democracy in other countries. Don't necessarily do it well, but and then authoritarian countries do the same thing sometimes. So I wrote a book about that. And I got really interested in political Islam as a regime type for probably obvious reasons. What I was kind of dancing around the whole time intellectually was this idea that it's not only the case that democracies act differently toward other countries, toward their environment, but I wanted to turn that around and say, does the international environment affect democracies or democracy? And that's the starting point for this book. So it sort of turns it around, kind of an outside-in book. And so I was thinking a lot about this. I began to notice historically, I mean, other people have noticed this too, but there are times and places when you have a lot of democracies and democracy spreading, the 1990s, the supposed end of history. For people like my age, it wasn't that long ago. But then you have times like the 1930s where democracy seems to be in fact is in retreat, and the real winning system seems to be maybe fascism. Some thought communism, but certainly not liberal democracy. The complicated reasons for that, but so that told me there's something sort of going on in the international environment, and sometimes it favors democracy, sometimes it seems to favor autocracy. So I began to read up on, and this suggests evolution, right? In the natural world, the environment can select for particular traits, white fur in bears. So why do you have white polar bears in the Arctic? Because you have snow and ice everywhere. It's kind of hard to be a grizzly bear or a black bear up there. So, in similar fashion, I was exploring the idea that, there's some things in the international environment that sometimes select for democracy, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they punish democracy, make it hard to be a democracy, to become one, to remain one. Um, and as I was doing this, I was just interested in this intellectually, but our own democracy, the United States, started to wobble a bit, a decade or so ago. You might trace it to even before that, but it became really an obvious headline story, uh, in the 2010s. And so I love our regime. I love the Federalist Papers, James Madison, the whole. So I was just very concerned as a citizen, uh, about our system, our regime. And was putting all this together a few years ago and say, why don't I write a book about this, about what I can bring to the study of democracy's travails from an international relations standpoint, and using all this evolutionary thinking that I've been looking at. But it took years. It really took a lot of reading and thinking and kind of contrarianism on my part, because there's some skepticism. I present papers at conferences, and sometimes people would, you know, not like it. Their brows would darken when I started talking about this, but others thought it was really interesting and promising. So that's what I did. And I'm happy. So this might be a good time to talk just very briefly about what the book's about. The book makes a few claims, and I've already hinted at some of them. I'll say the first big claim is that there's such a thing as the international environment. It's complex. I talk about what it consists of, but it can select for democracy. That is to say, it can reward being a democracy, or it can punish being a democracy. It can reward autocracy, depending on what's in that environment, right? Um, the environment consists of, I say, a number of elements. One of those is other states, obviously, but other states and their regime type. So how many democracies are already in the world? How powerful are they? It really helps if you have powerful states of your regime type for a lot of reasons. A second element in the environment is information about how well democracy works. Is it a good regime? Is it legitimate? Is it stable? Does it make a state secure and wealthy, or not? And in the 30s, as I said a minute ago, democracy was really, on the back foot, and it was hard to. A lot of people thought it was not a legitimate system; it was a failure. And a third big element in the international environment is international rules and institutions and norms and so on, which can be in favor of democracy or not, depending on their content. So, for example, a quick example, because this is kind of abstract, there are international multilateral trading agreements that the United States and other democracies put forward, belong to. And especially in recent decades, these have been pretty intrusive. They've said, if you want free trade with us, you have to make some changes. You have to um, have a rule of law. You have to have regular competitive elections. You have to have transparent institutions. Those are biased, deliberately biased in favor of liberal democracy. There are other types of agreements that the Chinese tend to favor, and other countries, which are far less intrusive. They just say, if you want to trade freely, just sign up and come to our meetings, and we'll work out a schedule for free trade. But we're never going to tell you how to run your business. We're not going to we don't care as long as you want to trade with us, right? So that's a more neutral system, but it ends up enabling authoritarian countries to be better off, right? So it doesn't give any particular advantage to democracies. There are other agreements in the past. So the Soviet Union had agreements with its fellow communist states that were biased in favor of communism. You had to be ruled by a communist party. So this is actually quite common in international history, and it's understudied. So I'm one of the people who've said we really need to attend to these environmental factors. That's a big claim. A second big claim of the book is already implicit. It's that great powers, big countries like the United States, have a lot of say over the content of the environment. Little countries, Costa Rica, Bangladesh, they have to accept the international environment that's there. They can't do much about it. But the United States and now China can actually do a lot about it. U.S. is a rule setter.
Right.
It propagates information like mad. Everybody watches the U.S. elections and how the U.S. is performing, right? Um, Third big claim is that things are not going well for democracy, that the international environment is seems to be selecting for authoritarianism now, and that's one big part of our problem. And I break that down into two problems actually, and we may want to talk about the first one. It's up to you guys and the audience, but one is the kind of the kind of content that America has been putting into the international environment has been counterproductive. And I call this a variety of liberalism. I call open liberalism. The United States is a liberal democracy, and by liberal, I don't mean left wing, FDR, big government or caring government. I mean a doctrine that upholds individual liberty as the highest political good. And the United States has been that for 230 odd years, for its whole time in existence. But we've changed what liberalism consists of over 230 some years. And now we have what I call open liberalism, which is a kind of an innovative, comes out of the 70s, really. It has many good features. It's done a lot of remarkable things, but I think it's really not serving vast portions of the American public. It's got a cultural and an economic face. It also is causing big problems in other industrial democracies, other wealthy democracies. And I should have said a minute ago, the fact that it's not just the United States, our democracy that's wobbling, but lots of others, particularly in Europe, is telling us something. There really is something in the environment. This is not just an American story. Although I say it is an American story among other things, but it's not just an American story. So another problem with the environment is the rise of authoritarian giants, the re-rise, if that's a word. And I have in mind China and Russia. And China is the bigger story here. As I've already hinted, China is a great power, has a lot of money, a lot of energy, big plans, is out in the world, certainly economically. It's invested, some of your audience will know, it is investing perhaps $1 trillion in infrastructure in the global south. And this involves a lot of influence and leverage. It's doing a lot of good. I mean, in some of these countries, they need infrastructure. That's why they're taking it. But there's a price that comes with that. And China has risen in recent decades, has done brilliantly, partly by joining this liberal international order that the United States set up and govern. But China has never been completely happy with that system. There are certain features of it they really don't like. The most obvious is human rights rules and norms at the United Nations and elsewhere, and all these NGOs that run around that are kind of empowered by the United Nations. China wants to change the rules and even the discourse about human rights, and they've been working the problem for a couple of decades. China doesn't like international internet rules and norms, which are about openness. China has the so-called Great Firewall. China practices national censorship on the internet and wants to make that normative They don't want to be the odd man out. They don't want to be looked down upon because they censor the internet. They want that to be the rule. Um, China also, and I'll get back to something I said a minute ago, doesn't like the typical trade rules that the United States and the Europeans and the Japanese want to impose when they have a free trade agreement. They want to just remove all the particularities and say, if you want to trade, trade. So I want to be clear, China is not spreading authoritarianism with its military or anything like that. Um, it's not clear they care that deeply about it. I think it is the case they are enabling authoritarian governments in Africa and parts of Asia through the Belt and Road Initiative, this vast infrastructure investment project. But they're not crusading for authoritarianism. Um, but it's a big problem. When the United States was the only superpower, it was shaping the environment to its advantage, and now it's got competition. The last big claim I make in the book is that it's not too late. There are things we can do to help the situation, to shape the international environment once again to favor liberal democracy. And I think it's important that we do that because we live in this world as well. And our ancestors, past leaders, have been very aware that the health of our own democracy is in some ways hostage to the international environment. I mean, President James Monroe, one of our Virginia local boys, knew this with the Monroe Doctrine, right? He, or his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, more precisely, saw that over in Europe, the monarchies in early 1820s were starting to reassert themselves against liberal revolutions in Spain and Portugal and parts of Italy. And Adams was quite worried that they would cross the Atlantic and start to reimpose monarchy on the Latin American republics. And so the Monroe Doctrine was in part a warning, don't try it. Don't do this. It was a bluff because we couldn't have stopped them if they had. But still, the motivation is important. Monroe, Adams, and most Americans at that point thought our republic is very young and fragile. It's much better off. It's much safer if we're in a hemisphere full of sister republics than it is if we're in a hemisphere full of monarchies, controlled from across the ocean. And that's a very different time and place, but the basic idea still obtains. The United States, our own democracy, if we agree it's in our national interest to remain a republic, constitutional republic, we do need to think not just about who's in the White House and whom to vote for and what the marginal tax rates should be, but what's the condition of the world, and particularly these elements I'm looking at and that I call the international environment. So that's the book in a probably way too large nutshell, but at least it's a nutshell.
No, that's great. Just a note to the audience, you feel free to use the Q&A function there at the bottom of the interface to write down your question, and we'll relay that to John. Let me start with the question. John, I heard you talking about your book once before, and you used the metaphor of a beaver. A beaver is an example of
not a hedgehog.
Not a hedgehog. Maybe he could. I think everybody knows less about hedgehogs. What do they do? I don't know.
Right.
We
they
all
know one big thing, but
they know one big thing.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Do they engage in niche construction? I don't know.
Yeah.
But we all know that beavers do modify their environment. They build a dam, the water level rises, it makes a little pond, and that I'm not totally sure all the ways that helps the beaver. I know the one thing it does is then the beaver can build a lodge that has an underwater entrance that protects it. So if the water is deep enough, it can go into its lodge, the underwater passage, and then the fox can't follow it, and it's safer.
Yeah, that's right.
It
traps food as well, and so it's easier for it to find food. They eat plants, so yeah.
Oh, nice. So it's like the beaver. It's like the net for the beaver also.
That's right.
Their food.
That's right.
So the beaver changes its environment in ways that makes it more advantageous to it, and in the same way, you're arguing states can and often do engage in this altering the broader system in which they're a part to make things better. My question, I guess, is about the predictability and controllability of actions that a state could undertake to make the environment more conducive for it. The beaver the beaver in some sense knows that making the dam will lead to a condition where it can make the lodge and have the safe interest and all that kind of stuff. It seems like things are a little more unpredictable in international relations. I was thinking about the Monroe Doctrine case. I guess it turned out well, but um, couldn't it have been the case that the Monroe Doctrine, ticked off
Yeah.
Spain or other European nations? They said, "Well, we were going to let the republics ride, but now because you said that, there's an element, there's maybe a human element in the leadership of other countries where you
Yeah.
can't always, I don't know. How do you respond to that kind of the uncontrollability or the unpredictability? Is there maybe like a spectrum of things that states can do, some of which are more kind of surefire techniques that will work, and some are more speculative and they may or may not. What's the thought
Yeah.
there?
You're certainly right. And we don't know what it's like to be a beaver any more than we know it's like to be a bat, right? But
Nice.
yeah, we can infer they do this, they keep doing it, it works. It seems like a pretty simple story. It is the story, by the way, is this is why we have long-toothed beavers. It's a just so story, but supposedly in the past you had beavers with short teeth, but they were selected out because they were at a disadvantage because they couldn't chop down the trees. Anyway, so that's a story of what's sometimes called coevolution, where the species is shaping its environment such that natural selection goes in a different direction than it otherwise would have, right? Um, so I think it's a good analogy. What the United States has tried to do, and other great powers too, what China is now trying to do is shape selection by altering the environment, if that makes sense. You're
Hmm.
certainly right that it can go wrong. Um, the United States really lucked out with the Monroe Doctrine. Um, it pains us to admit it, but it really was the British Royal Navy that protected the New World from the French and other countries who might have been up to mischief, in South and Central America.
Huh.
So it worked out. But I think it was just good luck. Part of my argument, Paul, is that open liberalism, which is it's not just an American invention, it's a Western invention from the 60s and 70s, isn't working. It's having unintended consequences, and the most that are again working against constitutional democracy in our country and others. And the most obvious one is, and this will sound like throwing all the blame on China, but it's actually not on China. I don't blame China at all for this. China worked very hard in the 90s to join the World Trade Organization, the WTO, and they negotiated this with the Clinton administration. And I'm old enough to remember I was for this. Not I wasn't important, but I was a professor. I was for it. I thought it was a great idea. It was bipartisan. I found a document from the Heritage Foundation from the late 90s saying this is great. This will press, and Democrats and Republicans all agreed, this will press China to liberalize, become more democratic. It will, because they're going to have to open their society even more. What can go wrong, especially in the age of the computer, right? The World Wide Web had just started to come online and so on. Well, what happened was China did join they finally joined in 2001 when George W. Bush was president, but the work had been done mostly by the Clinton folks. Um, so you can find data on this. China's exports just skyrocketed. They already were
Huh.
an exporting juggernaut, but they really, because what happened when they joined the WTO is they entered this vast multilateral agreement under which they got most favored nation status from everybody, including us. It just means they could export even more. So there's a really good economist at MIT, David Autor, he and his colleagues have done all these studies of the impact of the China shock. And they've calculated that 2.5 million in the first 10 years of the 21st century, 2.5 million manufacturing jobs were lost in the United States just to China. This is not about NAFTA, Mexico, it's just about China. And so did we see that coming? Well, we should have. Um, but it didn't figure in political discourse, and that is not so. unemployed or underemployed folks who would have had factory jobs. It's not the only problem facing the United States, but it's certainly one of them.
Hmm.
People who favor free trade, like I have, always say, well, it will raise our national income because we're going to produce more efficiently. And we can use the extra money we get to retrain people. They can learn to code or whatever. And
And
that's always brought up as the next step. And it actually is much harder to do. And I'm not even sure we've tried very hard to do this. So
and
what we
and
have is a huge number of discontented uh, people. The other thing I want to say on this is that open liberalism, as I'm calling it, has a cultural side as well. And this comes really out of the what's sometimes called the rights revolution of the 1960s, which had many, many wonderful features, but also um, had this notion of experimentation and self-creation coming out of the counterculture. Um, the good life is one of self-creation where you're not beholden to any barriers, any traditions. And it becomes really an imperative culturally to invent yourself and to be, the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman has this phrase, liquid modernity.
mhm.
So loyalty to community, to family, to really anything is always up for grabs. And there's a lot of pressure to be that kind of person. If you want to thrive in a modern Western country, you need to be more cosmopolitan. You need to be ready to change careers many times. Don't get too attached to anything, including your community. And so this works for a lot of people. I dare say, the three of us and a lot of our audience, trained academics, doing okay. But for a lot of people, this just doesn't work. And it's quite alienating. There's a well-known corollary problem. People who thrive under open liberalism tend to live in cities, and they tend to look down on people who don't thrive under this system. These are hicks, or at best, probably worse. And it's their fault. Why can't they get with the program? So, and of course, the people on the receiving end of that contempt know it. We have many, many moments in our politics in the last 15, 20 years where this comes to the surface, and it's often not forgotten. So there's a cultural divide as well that our lots of our colleague James Hunter saw coming in the early 90s, actually,
Yeah.
that goes along. It fits, I think, hand in glove with the economic divide. And it's very hard to disentangle. I'm not one of those people who says it's all economics or it's all culture. It's really both. These things are
Yeah.
entangled, but it's all part of this open liberalism program.
And
The
John,
other,
on this culture question, I wanted to bring up a question from one of our audience members, Martha Bayless, who asks, how much weight do you give to the export of American commercial entertainment, i.e., popular culture, in
Oh,
making liberal democracy look degenerate and dysfunctional? And we might also throw in, to what degree does American pop culture disproportionately sort of represent the ideals of open liberalism?
yeah. Yeah, Martha, that's a great question. I haven't worked this out fully, but my initial answer is yes, a lot. I think I'm not the greatest consumer of pop culture. Ask me about the 70s, I'm your man, but I don't, you know, but yes, I think the music and also the modes of the phones, the social media, those are things we didn't invent all of it. We certainly invented some of it and propel it out. So I'm like Marshall McLuhan, one of those people who believes the medium is the message. So it's not just the content, it's the form in which it takes, which really contributes to self-creation. Curate your image, then change it the next day. Everybody's got this miracle machine in their pocket, and so on. So yeah, I think, um, yeah. So my answer is yes. I would love to have a conversation sometime, Martha, about fleshing that out and to get your thoughts on it.
we also have a question from Scott Anderson, and he asks, uh, he wants you to make some predictions. John, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the prospects for the U.S. and some coalition of the willing to counter China and Russia and their allies?
Is this Scott, perhaps Scott, my former student now with lawfare and anyway, if
He's in Rockford,
whoever,
if that helps. I don't know.
say again.
He's in Rockford, Illinois, if that helps narrow it
Okay,
down.
maybe yes. If it, regardless of which Scott Anderson, thank you for the question. Yeah, coalition of the willing. Sorry, it's about China specifically, Paul.
Yeah, China. What are the prospects for the U.S. and in this coalition to counter China and Russia and their allies?
Yeah, I'll have to. So we're all dealing with the fact that we're having a new administration coming soon, and so I will. So I'll say a couple of things about that. On foreign policy, Marco Rubio will go through. I have no doubt he'll be the Secretary of State, and he's a former kind of Reagan-like Republican, very much would be wanting to oppose, contain China and Russia. He has of late, the reason why he was selected by President-elect Trump is because he's come around and sounding a bit more skeptical of this. That Reagan-like position, certainly George W. Bush position, it has been discredited in the Republican Party, certainly by Donald Trump and his folks who look upon it as warmongering and really using. I mean, a really extreme version of Steve Bannon's line that this was elites in Wall Street, international financiers using um, small town and rural Americans to fight wars to keep the empire going.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
I think I don't buy. There are parts of that have a grain of truth in them. I think the critique is overblown. But anyway, Marco Rubio has for whatever reason come around to moved in that direction a bit more. So he is not the Rubio of 5, 10 years ago. But um, I still think he is inclined to be very tough on Russia with Ukraine and quite tough on China with Taiwan and the South China Sea. And I raise that because U.S. allies, Japan, South Korea, in Southeast Asia, in Europe, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, they're all wondering what's in store. Is the United States going to be an isolationist country under a new Trump administration, or is it going to favor authoritarians? Is it going to cast aside NATO, withdraw from NATO? Is it going to abandon Ukraine to the tender mercies of Russia? And so these are real fears. I don't think so. I mean, I think there are going to be some changes. I think, for example, there will be a quicker settlement on Ukraine than there would have been had Kamala Harris won.
Oh,
The terms of that settlement, I don't know. I hope they're kind of tough on Russia, but I do think some kind of settlement, some kind of negotiated settlement is in the offing. But I do think um, with Rubio at state, if he lasts, if this works out, if there'll be there'll be more continuity than people might think on some of these flashpoints: Taiwan, South China Sea, Ukraine. Um, and so the U.S. alliance, and now a Trump administration is going to be tough on allies. It was before on Japan, South Korea, NATO. It's going to continue that. Europeans are paying more, and this is one good thing. Even Trump's opponents admit, Europeans are paying more for their defense than they did before there was a President Trump. And every U.S. president since at least the 60s has wanted this to happen.
oh,
And certainly since the 90s, when the Cold War ended and European military spending really plummeted, um, all American presidents have been, uh, disgusted by this. And Trump actually did something about it. So I expect him to try to do more. Um, but I'm pinning a lot of this on the fact that Rubio is going to be in Foggy Bottom running the State Department. If that doesn't last, if that doesn't work out, then I don't know what's going to happen. JD Vance, vice president, we don't know how much power he's going to have. Vice president, some have a lot of power, like Dick Cheney did. Some don't have it. I think Kamala Harris didn't have a lot of power as vice president. We don't know how much power Vance is going to have. He's more skeptical of certainly of Ukraine, and I sense he's more skeptical of NATO than say Marco Rubio. But we'll see how this all comes out. But I do think it's possible that this um, that the alliances will hold up. The questioner asked about coalition of the willing, which is Donald Rumsfeld's phrase from years ago, and it's not really about firm alliances. It's about the United States collecting temporary allies to do a job together. So, and the question presumes that would the U.S. might be able to cobble something together to oppose China and Russia. I think that's going to be actually quite hard. I think it's U.S. allies, the democracies that are together on Russia, at least. You know, if you look at world opinion on Russia and Ukraine, you might be surprised at how many countries, especially in the global South, um, are with Russia, or at least don't think this is a big deal. So a coalition of the willing might not work in that case. I think it really has to be U.S., the old allies, the old wealthy democracies. They're the ones who are really pushing back against Russia.
Mhm. I have a question that I want to roll into one of our listeners' questions, which has to do with the relationship between um, open liberalism and the rise of authoritarianism. And so I could think of two ways in which that relationship could work. One is that open liberalism is just turns out not to be very popular, at least for a certain segment of the population, as you pointed out earlier. It just doesn't.
Yeah.
It's marginalizing, and it doesn't work with the kind of expectations that people have of their lives. Another might be that there's something sort of inherently kind of weak about open liberalism that makes it that gives an opportunity to authoritarians. So that's a question that I kind of want to float out there, and maybe you can keep it in your mind as I read a question from one of our listeners named Mark Berner, because I think it's pretty closely related to this question. And Mark asked this question. He says, John, another account of the challenge facing liberal democracies here and in Europe is that they are procedural and not substantive. Post-liberals like Patrick Deneen and social theorists like your colleague James Hunter, for example, the view is that they create the formal conditions for democratic citizenship, but fail to nurture the culture that is necessary to underwrite a successful procedural state of limited laws. Do you agree or disagree with their critiques? And how does your analysis differ? And what hope for renewal do you have to offer? I think that ties into this question of open liberalism quite a bit, but I'll let you hold forth on any one of those inquiries.
Yeah, it does. And I know Mark Berner. Thank you for the question, Mark. Yes. So I think I mean procedures are important. I would rather use the word constitution. Constitutions are important. Basic laws are important. It's important that we have three branches of government. They're co-equal. It's important that none of them becomes too predominant over the others. I think the executive and the judiciary are too powerful, and the legislature is not powerful enough, and the states are not powerful enough vis-a-vis the federal. So those are, you know, I'll put them under the label procedures. They do matter. However, they're not. My critique of procedural democracy is that sometimes it seems like its proponents think it just can go on and on and on with no cultural underpinnings, no foundation, and I think that's clearly wrong. And I think open liberalism makes that mistake because open liberalism, among other things, it really says what our ancestors thought of as virtues are not necessary. You can just make it up as long as you're not harming another, you know, as long as everything's voluntaristic, you're not harming other people in what you do. You know, this idea of virtue, character, these are old-fashioned words. We don't want or need them. This is very, very different from how most of the American founders talked about it. Certainly John Adams, but James Madison as well. They thought long and hard about virtue as an underpinning, a necessary underpinning of a republic like ours. You know, Abraham Lincoln, I think. This is uh, these are people who worked to set up the Constitution or in Lincoln's case, interpret it and put it into practice and save it. But they were very alive to the role of virtue, character, commitment, and that sort of thing. They had different attitudes toward religion, but the typical notion was, some kind of piety is necessary to have a virtuous populace. So I'm not going to, argue for that any of these particulars, but I'm just trying to make the point that the idea that you don't need that procedures just can perpetuate themselves with no cultural underpinning is a really innovative idea, and I think we've learned it's a bad idea. So as to renewal, I think I'm a Tocquevillian. Alexis de Tocqueville is probably the most articulate person on this now that I think of it. And so Tocqueville most listeners will know a bit about him. I assume a Frenchman, young aristocrat, came to the United States in the 1830s to write a book about prisons, but he ended up writing a masterpiece called Democracy in America. And one of the many points in that rich book that he makes it still with us is America has this thick civil society, a set of overlapping organizations that are public but not related to the state. So things like we would say now trade unions, bowling leagues, scouts, churches and synagogues and mosques. These things are schools of democracy, Tocqueville calls them. They're where virtue is cultivated. It's not something that can be cultivated by the central state. The central state and its institutions depend on this cultivated virtue within these communities. So I'm one of those people who one of whose worries about open liberalism is I won't say it despises these more traditional old communities and civil organizations, but it hasn't done much to help them. It might even be seen as eroding them. So one example might be private charities, let's say Catholic charities in some cities have years and years of partnership with city government in running soup kitchens and halfway houses, homeless shelters, orphanages, and so on. And there's been a push lately because the Catholic Church has policies that are discriminatory about who gets to be a priest and so on, that a liberal government can't cooperate with the Catholic Church anymore on these things. And this has happened in some cities in this country, Canada, and elsewhere. And that strikes me as an effort to remove, and weaken things like the Catholic Church from public functions. And I think that's just a big mistake for a lot of reasons. So that's an example of how, I think a democratic state should recognize that it really depends on what Tocqueville was writing about almost 200 years ago. And I think open liberalism has lost sight of that.
John, we have a couple of questions that have to do with your idea of open liberalism, and specifically, you mentioned that it has some weaknesses, and I think people are curious about what those weaknesses are, and specifically, how those weaknesses relate to the international order. And here are the questions. The first one asks, this is from John Colasano. John, are you saying that the weakness of open liberalism is in part because of the expansion of rights to marginalized communities? Should we not have done that, or should it have been done differently? And then a question more about the international role. Wayne Eastman asks, has Putin's anti-woke position, in your judgment, been effective in altering the international ecosystem against the U.S. and Western Europe? What do you think the U.S. and its allies can do to make Putin's anti-wokeness less effective, if you think it has been effective?
Yeah. Yeah, good. So on the first question, no, I certainly embrace the extension of, or the recognition of the human rights of huge numbers of Americans who were denied their rights. I want to be quite clear about that. And so I'm from North Carolina. I'm from the South, and the South had to change the Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, these things in the 60s. I think the the trouble came really with the counterculture that was historically somewhat entangled in that, but but also in tension with it in some ways. So if you look at some of the tensions between the civil rights movement um, and the Yippies, let's say in Chicago, 1968, there was a lot of tension. We remember um, the folks in Grant Park against Mayor Daley and the cops and the National Guard, as if the protesters were all on the same page. They actually weren't. There was a lot of tension over strategy and tactic and what kind of country they were working for. They were all against the Vietnam War, but they had a lot of differences. And so I think the problem came again with the counterculture and its idea of self-creation, which they took to be an insight, kind of building on the civil rights movement, but I think is quite different. It's not. I don't think it's something that Dr. King had in mind, um, and other civil rights leaders. So just to be clear about that, Putin and wokeness, yeah, it really bothers me that he has co-opted this. He's a clever guy. I don't know what his inner convictions are, of course. It may be that he has himself evolved from a KGB operative in the 80s to a genuine pious Orthodox Christian. I don't know, but he's certainly posing as the latter. And it is interesting, a former KGB officer now, but um, so he's been effective. He knows he and his he knows which friends to make within Russia and within Europe and indeed in North America if he wants to do that. He knows um, what kind of language to use. Many of his speeches are chock full of social conservative tropes, and yeah, I think he's capitalized on a lot of the alienation that I say open liberalism has caused in the West. So to someone like me, who's again old enough to remember the Cold War, this is kind of bizarre. And yet I have to hand it to him. He's been quite successful
John,
in
do you think,
co-opting this.
sorry to interrupt, do you think that Putin thinks of Americans as being members of the audience that he's addressing when he gives these kinds of anti-woke speeches? Is that on his mind, do you think?
Well, I think so. Yeah, I think so. I think he thinks about foreign audiences a lot. And maybe because he was with KGB, I don't know. But I remember this is not really on wokeness, but after 9/11, so years ago, I remember he visited the United States. And this is only a few weeks after. I remember hearing him interviewed on NPR. And a reporter said, Mr. Putin, and he had been president of Russia for a couple of years by then. Some Americans think that are calling these terrorists animals. They're so angry. What do you think of that? And the questioner was disapproving of this. And Putin said, I think it is wrong because I don't think it is strong enough language. He was trying to reach the American id with that. And I remember this well. Right after 9/11, there were a lot of freaking out and very angry Americans, and Putin was playing right to that America. So and that was on a visit to the U.S. Maybe that's a peculiar time, but I do think he thinks about foreign audiences, let's say, in Europe. Um, the FSB, the Russian Secret Service, has funneled a lot of money to um, let's call them disruptive populist parties in Europe, and has acted to try to fix elections in former Soviet republics. So yeah, he doesn't just work his will in Russia. He thinks about foreign audiences and foreign systems as well.
John, do you think that, but Putin's response, as intemperate as it might be, do you see that as part of the maybe backfiring of the U.S.'s attempt to weave open liberalism into their crafting of the international ecosystem? Is that an example of what you're talking about? Maybe like overstepping, or maybe an inherent weakness in open liberalism itself as a part of this shaping of our ecological niche.
So again, can I ask you to flesh out a bit? So weakness of open liberal. I'm open to that to it being a weak, but
Oh,
can
just that in the book, for instance, you talk about one of the unintended consequences, perhaps, of open liberalism is that it pushes for uh, conditions where every individual can sort of radically self-determine. But you point out, one of the options that should be live for individuals is to reside within some kind of like sustained tradition to
right.
say no, we don't want to reconfigure and decide anew and afresh in each moment. But some aspects of the open liberal culture have made that more difficult, have created a pressure that makes it difficult. And you could see Putin as a really extreme case of reacting to open liberalism. Or do you think that's not really the right way to frame that conflict?
No, I think that's fair. I think right. Again, my one of my touchstones is Tocqueville, and if you value, as a lot of us do, these organic, sometimes very old communities, and by the way, not all of them were healthy. A lot of them are should have been got rid of, but by no means all. Um, if I'm Vladimir Putin and I'm really trying to break up, and I think one of his goals is to break up the West, and he's having some success. How do I do that? Well, I'll try a lot of different things, but one thing is find this, locate these divides within Western countries. Again, one of which James Hunter located in the early '90s, with his culture wars thesis, and exploit that. Try to widen it, and uh, so present yourself in your program, present yourself as an international champion of community, of tradition, of religion. Um, Again, never mind how you treat certain religious people in your own country or in Ukraine, but present yourself that way.
Yeah.
Do it credibly, and it might work. It just seems like a remarkably effective tactic to me.
No, that makes sense. In our last 3 minutes, John, what would you hope readers would take away? Kind of what's the take home point of the book or of the project?
Well, let's see. I'll have to make a somewhat complex point. We Americans are not alone. So there's a world out there, much of which shares our problems, has the same problems. It's partly our fault, but partly their fault. But so that is in a way bad news that if we're thinking, well, at least these other countries will keep democracy going. Not necessarily. We're all in this together. But the good part of that is this has been the case in the past. And I refer to the 1930s a great deal in the book and probably tonight as well. But the 30s result a horrible time, Great Depression, rise of fascism, Stalin's Soviet Union, and then World War II with all the horrors there. Um, but at the end of that parade of horrors, democracies led by the United States decided to make some serious changes. And this is the inauguration of what I call welfare liberal internationalism. We can't go back to that. And I wouldn't want us to go back to it fully. But um, one of the virtues of constitutional democracy is its resiliency, its ability to reform, not have revolutions. We had one of those a long time ago, but reform, see what the real barriers to liberty are right now, and they aren't what they were 100 years ago, and deal with those and build new institutions and practices to deal with those. And that's a hard thing, and it's a work of I think it's a work of at least a generation. But that we've done it before tells me we can do it again.
Well, I think that's a good place to end the conversation. So I want to say thank you to everybody for joining us in this Hedgehog After Hours, and thanks especially to John Owen for talking to us about his wonderful new book. Paul, you can hold it up for us. The Ecology of Nations, American Democracy in a Fragile Order, which came out from Yale Press. Look it up and buy many copies.
On sale at quality stores everywhere, I'm sure.
Everywhere. And thanks, Paul, for joining the conversation and asking great questions. Please join us for our next After Hours discussion with Notre Dame moral theology professor Paul Schurz. He's going to come talk about his new book, The Ethics of Precision Medicine, The Problems of Prevention in Healthcare. And that will be on Tuesday, December 10th at 7 o'clock. And please go to hedgehogreview.com to read more and to subscribe. Thank you all very much, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Kyle.
Thanks.